This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on From Reagan to Clinton. The first thing to talk about in the rise of Ronald Reagan and the Reagan Revolution is an understanding of where this new movement came from that put Reagan into power. This new movement was called the New Right. The New Right had been a development of what's called a counter-ideology to the Keynesian hegemony. Here's what I mean by that. Hegemony basically means the predominant or overall consensus of the culture. Typically, when there's a consensus where the majority of people believe in something, there's usually a development of a counter-ideology, some kind of other system or group of people who have a different belief system. And the big question is whether or not their belief systems are eventually going to be able to overtake the consensus or the hegemony. In this particular case, this did happen, but it took about 40 years for it to happen. It started off with Friedrich Hayek, who we talked about in class. He wrote this book called A Road to Serfdom. He wrote that book back in the 1930s and 1940s. It was followed up in the 1950s by an economist named Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman wrote a book called Free to Choose and eventually would establish a major part of the college system on his beliefs in economics. After that, this eventually trickled down into politics with Barry Goldwater, who ran in 1964 on overall a libertarian platform of making government much more minimal in its overall effects and policies. He wrote a book called The Conscience of a Conservative. The main themes of all of these individuals were individual liberty, independence, and the development of character as the basis to the republic and democracy. Conservative institutions. One thing that conservatives understood very well in this new right was that you don't win by just going out and giving ideas or persuading people. You have to actually establish institutions that are going to persuade people over time and challenge the consensus or overall hegemony. And conservatives were really good at doing this. From 1945 up until 1980, they established a number of major institutions that would challenge the major principles that were within the liberal or Keynesian consensus at the time period. So what they did was they went out and they established institutions that were going to challenge based upon conservative and libertarian principles. For example, William F. Buckley established the National Review, which is a major publication that's still around today that produces ideas about libertarian and conservative ideas and challenges the overall hegemony of Keynesian thinking. Also, conservatives were really good about establishing think tanks. For example, the Heritage Foundation or the libertarian institution Cato, which is still around today. They put out numerous reports and gathered together intellectuals from across the country who share conservative and libertarian principles. What conservatives understood was that you don't win in this kind of fight in one generation or one presidential cycle. You do it over a generational battle. Now, their hope was they would do this somewhere in the 1950s or 1960s. They were wrong on that. It would take all the way up until 1980 for them to win this battle. But what they understood was that it was the long haul for winning, not in the individual battles that would give them the win. The Conservative Coalition. So conservatives developed around three major groups, and these groups don't always get along. This coalition included business conservatives, who favor less taxes and less regulations for economic growth, religious conservatives, who favor a strong government, and they want governmental action in society, but they want it based upon upholding traditional values, especially making sure the family is strong, and neoconservatives, who didn't really form up until about the 1970s. Neoconservatives favor a strong American presence in leadership and foreign policy. Now you notice that there are a lot of tensions that are involved here. Business conservatives, for example, share along with religious and neoconservatives the fear of strong overall government in the economy, but they also favor things that are going to allow for as much economic growth as possible. So for example, business conservatives are very much in favor of having as much immigration as possible because it provides cheap labor for them. That's not something that religious conservatives or neoconservatives favor, at least not on the legal immigration side. Religious conservatives, unlike business conservatives, are in favor of strong government, but not government action within the economic sphere. They want to see government action within the traditional values sphere. Business conservatives fear that because they fear that if there's too much governmental action in one sphere, it trickles over into another sphere. Neoconservatives favor strong American leadership and foreign policy. Libertarians are very much against this. They feel like in all areas, government needs to be minimal, otherwise you see an expansion of power. So while there is this conservative coalition and overall themes are pretty much the same, there are a lot of tensions between these groups as well. Libertarians. So libertarians come from a variety of traditions, but one of the most important in America is a woman named Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand was a Russian immigrant, so you can imagine she's coming out of the context of communism. She's very much critical of growing government. And so she wrote a number of books. They were fictional books, but they stressed the idea of governmental control and how it subtly grows. She ended up founding a philosophy called objectivism and a philosophy called moral egoism. Her argument was this. She said, we don't create reality, we study reality. And what does reality teach us? Well, objective reality teaches us that all individuals operate under self-interest. This means that any belief in altruism is just what we call subtext. In other words, here's the idea. Altruism is rhetorical flourishes. It's rhetorical statements about why we ought to do things for cooperation or why we ought to do things to help people. But in the end, it's rhetoric. What's really underneath that rhetoric? Well, our self-interest. In other words, everybody is looking out for what benefits them the most because that's our human nature. So when we use government to try to enact some kind of altruistic principle, in her belief, we're not really doing it for altruism. We're doing it for our self-interest. Maybe the self-interest is something that's really like selfish. Maybe we're using altruism in order to impose regulations on a business that we just don't like for some reason or is competing with us. Or maybe it's even more subtle than that. Maybe we're putting out altruism there for our own ego, that we just want to make ourselves appear to be really good people. So what's the problem with that? I mean, if I end up helping other people through the government, why is that a bad deal? Well, in Ayn Rand's belief, it's because you're using your self-interest through the rhetoric of altruism to make it sound really good in order to steal from others. And the government is the perfect way to do that. I mean, if you think about it, the government has the ultimate control in society. In fact, libertarians call it that they have the control of the bayonet. Now, obviously, the government doesn't use the bayonet, the gun, to go out and get people. But if you think about it, in a sense, they do. If you don't pay your taxes, what happens? You go to prison. If you don't do the things the government wants to do on the more minimal level, they fine you. In other words, the government has the ultimate amount of control to take things from you. And, who punishes them? I mean, typically a criminal is punished by the government. Well, there's no one to punish the government. The government can just take it from you. Now, true, there is no such thing as the government. The people are the ones who tell the government what to do. But we're using the utensils of the government to basically go out and say, hey, this is my altruism, you've got to follow it. Which means we're using the ultimate control of thievery in order to take from people. And that was the idea of Ayn Rand. Our self-interest masked as altruism, using government to steal from people. So all of these coalitions eventually led up to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan actually started off as a Roosevelt Democrat. He was a liberal back in the 1940s, but he eventually grew disillusioned. He was an actor in Hollywood, and he noticed that Hollywood, in his opinion, was too much dominated by the radical left. So he left Hollywood, and he went to work at General Electric, and while he was there, he became a strong conservative. Put out a whole bunch of ads for General Electric and became a good actor as far as doing these advertisements go. And so some people picked up on the fact that he had conservative ideas and he was a good actor. He looked good. He was somebody who could communicate with people, and so he was promoted in the Republican Party. Eventually, he won the governorship in California, and whoever wins the governorship in states like California tend to be promoted pretty quickly up the line because California is such a big state. And he was seen as a possible source for winning elections in the future. So conservatives saw him as this effective communicator. In fact, that's what he became known as in the conservative cause. He became known as the great communicator. So why did Reagan become president? Number one. During this time period, a big part of the reason why he became president had to do with foreign policy failures. In the 1970s, foreign policy under Richard Nixon was based upon realism and détente. Détente was the idea of a strategy of trade and realism to lessen tensions with the Soviet Union. Now, on the surface, a lot of people criticized Richard Nixon, and they felt that he was doing something that really we shouldn't have been doing with the Soviet Union, which was trying to do too much trade and too much negotiations with them, as if it was almost like he was fooling himself into believing that the Soviet Union would actually work with us. It really wasn't the point. Détente was a strategy. It was a strategy of lowering military tensions while dividing the Soviet Union and China through trade. So we would trade with one country, and by doing that, we would force the other country into having to compete against their communist ally in trade. But out of nowhere, in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and this led to a lot of disillusionment. The feeling had been that we were trying to lower tensions, and out of nowhere, Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. Afghanistan is right to the north of Iran and Iraq. These are major oil areas. Right below that is the Persian Gulf. The fear was the Soviet Union had used this time of lowered tensions in order to just stall us so that they could eventually get control of oil. Why did Reagan become president? Number two. So another major foreign policy failure had to do with Iran. America had backed Shah Pahlavi in Iran. You probably remember we talked about this. Since the 1950s, after we overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh, we ended up backing Shah Pahlavi. But in 1979, the Iranians rebelled against Shah Pahlavi and put Ayatollah Khomeini in power. Shah Pahlavi came to America at that time after he had been exiled from the country for cancer treatment, and that led to an attack on the American embassy there, in which 66 American hostages were held for over 140 days. President Carter tried to solve this problem. He did it through a plan where he had helicopters fly over the Saudi Arabian desert, and they were supposed to land in Iran, get the people out of the embassy, and then fly them back to the Persian Gulf. Unfortunately, these helicopters hit into a sandstorm in the Saudi Arabian desert, and the plan failed. America looked like we had failed and that we were unable to deal with this Iranian revolution. So this overall disillusionment in foreign policy, as well as disillusionment in where the Keynesian economics was going, led to Ronald Reagan winning the election of 1980. And when he did, he enacted the following economic policies. Both President Carter and President Reagan had allowed the Federal Reserve Chairman, Paul Volcker, to raise interest rates. In fact, interest rates were raised into double digits. And just think about that. Today, interest rates are about the closest you get to zero as possible. They're about 3%. This time period, interest rates were raised all the way up to 12%, in some cases 15 or 18%. Why would you do something like this? Well, if you raise interest rates that high, what you're basically doing is you're rebooting the economy. Here's what I mean by that. What Paul Volcker was doing was he was raising interest rates so high, people wouldn't take out loans. If you don't take out loans from the banks, that means that you're not going to have much economic activity. That crashes the economy. In fact, in essence, we're creating a recession. Why would you do something like that? Well, as the economy collapses, prices are going to fall. And that means you get rid of inflation. So remember the problem of stagflation in the 1970s. The Federal Reserve is basically getting rid of inflation. Well, okay, let's say you get rid of inflation, which actually did. By the time we got out to 1983, inflation had fallen down to the lowest rates it had been at. That doesn't mean the economy is going to start growing. Well, Reagan had a plan for how he believed the economy would grow. In 1981, he passed the Economic Recovery Tax Act, which lowered the top tax rates from 70% to 50%. Later in the decade, he would continue lowering the top tax rates all the way down to 28%. And he continued deregulation in major industries like the airline industries and the banks. He hoped that by doing this, this would provide for what's called supply-side economics, or what became popularly known as Reaganomics. The idea was that you would lower tax rates, rich people would get to hold on to more of their money. Well, what are they going to do with that money if they just hold on to it? Well, they don't just hold on to it. They're self-interested. They want it to grow. So they're going to go out and they're going to start saving or investing in building more factories. And that will start to boost overall economic activity. So what are the positive achievements that we get out of the Reagan time period? Well, for one, unemployment started off in 1980 at 8%. But by the time Reagan left office in 1988, it was down to 5%. Also, United States GDP grew at an average of 2 to 3% annually. Now, I know it probably doesn't mean much to you when you hear those numbers, but 3% growth is actually really good for overall GDP. In fact, on an average, it grew 2 to 3% from 1980 up to 1988. In some cases, per year, it was growing at 5 or 7% annually. 2 to 3% is just the average. Americans also had a renewed sense of optimism. During this time period, they felt that there was long-term potential for economic growth. Plus, deregulation broke down monopolies, especially the one in the airline industry. You had much more options, created much more competition, prices came down. Negative effects. So some of the negative effects included the following. First off, real wages dropped. The top 1% of Americans made about 80% of gains in wages, while the median wage for most Americans, that's the middle wage, went up only 3%. Another problem had to do with debt. There was a guy named Laffer, and Laffer came up with this idea that Reagan followed called the Laffer curve. The idea was you can lower tax rates and still collect more tax money. How is that possible? Well, if you can get economic growth happening, even if you lowered tax rates, you'd collect more money. So for example, let's say we're taxing people at 10%, just to make it easy here, and you have $100 in your hand. Well, I tax you 10% of $100, I make $10 out of that deal, right? But what if I were to lower the tax rates? Say I lowered the tax rates to 5%. But at the same time, let's say now you have $1,000 in your hand. You're going to end up collecting a lot more money from taxes of 5% of $1,000 than you would 10% of $100. The point is you can lower tax rates if the economy grows and still collect more money. So that was the idea of the Laffer curve. Did it actually work? Well, the debt in the federal government from 1980 to 1988 rose from $900 billion to $2.3 trillion. For the first time in our history, we went from being the biggest creditor in the world to the biggest debtor in the world. In fact, in 1983, David Stockman, Reagan's advisor, admitted that this whole Laffer curve, this whole idea of supply-side economics, was based actually upon faith, not upon any real economic evidence. Reagan's foreign policy, number one. In the first Reagan foreign policy term, he ended up basing most of his term upon rollback. In other words, he wanted to not just contain the Soviet Union, he wanted to beat them. And he did this primarily through a new policy called the Strategic Defense Initiative. A lot of people ended up calling this Star Wars because of the time period with the movies. Star Wars system was meant to be a way to knock down Russian missiles with a space-based laser system. Now, most scientists knew at the time that this could not work. Nobody really had the belief that this was going to work at this time. But the idea was if we were to spend a lot of money on the Strategic Defense Initiative, it would force the Soviets to do the same kind of thing in competition. They wouldn't be able to keep up, and this would bankrupt their system. Reagan also funded this time period the Mujahideen Holy Warriors, who were fighting off in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union with the intention of bankrupting the Soviet Union by forcing them to almost like a parallel situation that we had with Vietnam. And on top of this, Reagan funded right-wing dictators in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala, with his belief that if we could put a ton of money into fighting the allies of the Soviet Union in Central America, that this would over time bankrupt the Soviet Union. Reagan's foreign policy too. So Reagan is usually seen as this president who really believed in rollback and established this very strong leadership against the Soviet Union, but he's actually far more complicated than that. In the second term, he realized that the president of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, was trying to reform the USSR. And so he decided to start working with the USSR, not forcing this overall belief of rollback. In fact, he replaced his hardline advisors with realists, people who believed, like Nixon did, with détente. He then met with Gorbachev on several occasions for peace talks and the reduction of nuclear arms. At one point, he even called for eventually having a zero nuclear world, in fact, getting rid of all nuclear bombs. And most likely, he didn't really believe he was ever going to get rid of every single nuclear bomb, but the idea behind it was to reduce tensions and to get to a point in which both countries would have so few nuclear weapons that this really would not be a major source of tension. Notice that Reagan here kind of had two sides to himself. He switched very quickly from a very aggressive, strong leadership position into one that was much more based upon diplomacy, based upon the context and circumstances. So when Reagan left office, his vice president, George Bush, ran for the presidency. Now, George Bush was always suspected by conservatives as being too moderate. For example, George Bush used to be pro-choice in the 1970s, but in 1980 he became pro-life because he had to in order to help Reagan win the election. George Bush has a long history of working in the government. At one point, he was the head of the CIA. George Bush knew the way government worked, and so he seemed to be a very good person for the Republicans to choose in order to start running for office. But conservatives really weren't sure about him. He won in 1988, again in the election against Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. The reasons why he ended up winning was at the time the economy was strong. There was a strong Reagan legacy coming out of the 1980s. But also on top of that, one of the Bush advisors, Lee Atwater, noticed that Michael Dukakis actually might win. In fact, throughout most of the election, Michael Dukakis was ahead of George Bush. So Lee Atwater started putting out a lot of messages about Michael Dukakis that would scare the public. For example, he portrayed Michael Dukakis as being an ultra-liberal governor from Massachusetts. He also played upon racial fears. For example, at one point, Lee Atwater put out an ad about a furlough program that Michael Dukakis had established in which prisoners could be let out for a weekend in order to see their families and so forth. Actually, the furlough program that Michael Dukakis put out was done in about 30 other states. Unfortunately, on one occasion, one of these men, Willie Horton, went out and raped and murdered a woman on his time off during this furlough. And this became a way to play up fears amongst people. Willie Horton was African American, so there was some questioning about whether or not Lee Atwater did this in order to plan racial fears. Well, we found out. About 3 years later, Lee Atwater, right before he died, admitted to the fact that he used racial fears in order to get people afraid of having Michael Dukakis put into office. Bush and Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein had been attacking Iraq throughout the 1980s, and we actually used, Bush and Saddam Hussein. Hussein had been attacking Iran throughout the 1980s, and in fact, the United States used Iraq, this is typical in foreign policy, as one of our, not really allies, but as a proxy. We had been funding both Iran and Iraq to attack each other in order to weaken both sides. By the 1990s, Hussein believed that the United States was not so much on his side, but the United States really didn't mind some of his actions because of the balance of power issues in this area. So Hussein actually told a Bush advisor that he was planning on invading Kuwait. He was going to do that because of something called horizontal drilling, meaning that Kuwait was drilling for oil, but they were drilling underneath the ground so that they could actually drill within Iraq territory, and they were in essence stealing oil from Iraq. The Bush advisor at the time just didn't say anything when Hussein made this move, and that gave Hussein the notion that the United States would be okay with Iraq invading into Kuwait. But once they did invade into Kuwait, Bush decided that he had to lead a coalition to stop this. He had to stop it because Hussein was invading the sovereignty of Kuwait. Kuwait was an ally of ours, and we did fear that if Hussein took over Kuwait, he would control a huge portion of oil within that part of the world. So after that, after the war was done, Bush decided not to invade Iraq itself. And he decided not to do that because he wanted to satisfy the French and Russian partners that we had in the coalition. The success of the Iraqi war boosted Bush's popularity and made it look like he was going to easily win in the next election, the 1990 recession. However, from 1990 to 1992, the economy faced a major slowdown. This was largely due to the growing debts and deficits that caused worries amongst investors. Bush had promised at one point that he was not going to raise any taxes. In fact, in a very famous statement, he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." But he ended up compromising with Democrats in the Democratic Congress in order to raise some taxes to try and start paying down some of the debts. This left him weak. It left him weak for most people because of the recession, but also left him weak amongst conservatives because they felt that he had sold them out on the issue of taxes. So in 1992, Bush ended up running against the Democratic governor from Arkansas, Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton had noticed that throughout the 1980s, Democrats were not winning against conservatives because the time period had changed. It was no longer a Keynesian time period. So he helped in creating something called the Democratic Leadership Council, or the DLC. The DLC tried to pursue what they called a third way of politics, a way in between liberalism and Reagan conservatism. So no longer were we going to be Keynesianism, but at the same time he wanted to try to moderate Reagan supply-side economics. He favored deregulation, favored international free trade, very much like Reagan conservatism. But he argued that there was still a role for government to protect workers within this framework of new economic competition. So in 1992, Clinton won. But when he won, he only won because 35% of the people in America showed up to vote. There was a very small amount of people who ended up coming out to vote. At the time, too, people perceived that the economy was weak. Actually, it wasn't true. By the time of the election, the economy was picking up steam again. But Clinton was able to win because of that perception. And then on top of that, there was a third-party candidate who entered in named Ross Perot. Ross Perot established his own party called the Reform Party, but most of the people who voted in the Reform Party were Republicans who were just dissatisfied with George Bush. So this ended up splitting the Republican vote and allowing Clinton to win the election. When Clinton came into office, he wanted to raise taxes in order to pay down the deficit and debt. He also pursued international free trade. He wanted to create a healthcare reform system to reduce costs on business and make business more competitive. And he wanted to pursue an equal rights agenda, especially for gay people, by pursuing open service in the military. He also wanted to reform governmental programs like welfare to protect workers, but to lessen the overall growth of government. The new conservative media. So during the 1980s, there was a doctrine called the Fairness Doctrine. The Fairness Doctrine stated that radio stations were public stations, and so therefore you had to have equal time for different voices, both conservative and liberal. Under Ronald Reagan, this was deregulated and gotten rid of. Fairness Doctrine came to an end, and that led to the rise of new voices that most of the public wanted, especially conservative voices like Rush Limbaugh. In fact, Rush Limbaugh was so popular that there were Rush rooms created across the country that dominated in bars and restaurants. People would go out and they would listen to Rush Limbaugh, and Rush Limbaugh promoted a narrative, and the narrative was this, that Clinton was a 1960s radical who was undermining American capitalism and traditional values, especially as we'll talk about with some of Clinton's sexual exploits. This seemed to be proved by a lot of his problems. The big thing that Clinton did during this time period was free trade. For example, in early 1992, he helped to pass NAFTA, which was a regional free trade agreement that lowered tariffs between America, Mexico, and Canada. Back in the 1940s, there was a agreement passed called GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which lowered tariffs. In the 1990s, Clinton would participate in creating an enforcement mechanism to this called the World Trade Organization. This was an international court that helped to enforce the lowering of tariffs. At the same time, Clinton faced some major problems internationally. The Soviet Union was gone, but with the fall of the Russian leadership, it left countries with numerous fighting ethnic groups. For example, Yugoslavia broke up into Serbia, Bosnia, and Herzegovina. The Serbian president, Milosevic, tried to get rid of Serbians in order to create what he called a Greater Bosnia. Now, the problem was how to deal with this kind of genocide. Well, at first, Clinton just didn't get involved because of the fear that if he did get involved, he would get enveloped in a European problem. But by the late 1990s, he realized how important it was that the United States get involved to stop this kind of genocide. So he led a NATO coalition that weakened Milosevic, led to an agreement to end the genocide, and eventually Milosevic was voted out of office by his own people. He was caught by the International Criminal Court, and he died in The Hague of natural causes while he waited for trial. The Rwandan genocide. Part of the reason why we acted during the time period of the Bosnian genocide had to do with the Rwandan genocide. In the 1950s, the Belgians had left Rwanda with a division between the Tutsis and the Hutus. The Hutus had tried to get revenge on the Tutsis because the Tutsis had been the group of people the Belgians had ended up favoring. The Belgians had actually taken Africans in Rwanda and separated them into these two groups. They had never existed before, and they claimed that the Tutsis were somehow racially superior to the Hutus. The Hutus tried to get their revenge in the 1990s. It was a massive genocide. Clinton at the time did not want to get involved, so he redefined the situation as not genocide, but acts of genocide. The reason why he did that was if something's a genocide, we have to get involved. That's our agreement after the Holocaust during World War II. By calling it acts of genocide, this would allow him to condemn what was happening without getting directly involved. Later in the decade, he expressed regret for this when he realized how disastrous this had been, and that was part of the reason why we got involved in the problems in Bosnia and Serbia. Of course, the big issue that came up during the 1990s that most people didn't realize was as important as it was until 2001 was the growth of a new Middle Eastern terrorism. In 1993, there had been an attack on the World Trade Centers. Underneath the World Trade Centers, there had been bombs placed upon the major rudders upholding the World Trade Centers, and the hope amongst these terrorists was that when these went off, the entire buildings would collapse. It didn't happen on this particular occasion, but it was actually a signal to something that was growing that we didn't realize called Al-Qaeda, or the base, which was led by Osama bin Laden. Now, what was different about this Middle Eastern terrorism from other forms? This was the first Middle Eastern terrorism that tried to be not regional, not just dealing with problems like, for example, Israel versus Palestine, but much more it had to do with international cross-boundary terrorism. The hope amongst these terrorists was that they could recreate a Muslim caliphate that would stretch across the Middle East all the way out into Asia. And the structure of Al-Qaeda was to have basically cells of terrorists, 1 to 5 terrorists that would be independent. They had a leader, Osama bin Laden, but the leadership was not direct. Terrorists would gain signals around the world of when to act, and by doing that, it would make it very difficult for governments to try to control them. Of course, during this time period, Clinton was constantly undermined by his own actions. Clinton had been caught in numerous different sex scandals. For example, he almost didn't get elected because it came out right before his election that he had had a sex scandal for about 10 years while a governor in Arkansas with a woman named Jennifer Flowers. Then, during Clinton's time in office, there was a lawsuit brought against him from a woman named Paula Jones, who claimed that Governor Clinton had sexually harassed her in Arkansas. While that lawsuit was going on, they were trying to find evidence about it. They discovered that Clinton had had a sexual relationship with one of the staffers in the White House, and this was done in the Oval Office. Her name was Monica Lewinsky. While he was on the stand in the grand jury, he at one point claimed that he had never had sex with Monica Lewinsky. When it came out that it was obvious that he had, the point was that he had lied or perjured himself. Now, a lot of people thought at the time that what the claim was that he was lying or perjuring about sex. Not really. The claim was that he was lying or perjuring about sexual activity on the job that would show a pattern of behavior that might demonstrate that he sexually harassed women. So the claim of him that led up to the impeachment trial for him was about perjury, not adultery.